Salete, and welcome to the Sunday edition of this week's virtual mentoring Hangouts. Our topic, as it was yesterday, is assessing and reassessing our approaches to assessment. And yesterday we had a fantastic and amazing conversation about everything from the ACTFL integrated performance assessment on the grand scale summative assessments down to the very micro scale of how do you check for understanding in a simple formative way that doesn't require any paper. And we shared all kinds of amazing strategies and ideas that I can try to summarize if folks are interested. But we also really worked together to understand ways that changing our perspective on assessment and changing the way that we go about assessing our students can change the culture of a class and can change the focus from the kind of stereotypical student whining about why did I make a such and so and I really need an A. Or mom is going to take my phone away and my life will be over. I think we've all probably had, and some of us may have even been that student. But moving from that to really seeing assessment as something that is helping us and the students see what's going well, what's going right, and where do we go next? And yay, Brenda is here. Sorry, Brenda. Hi. Welcome. I'm so glad that you are here. We're going to be a big crowd today, I think, but since it's just you and me so far, could you just take a moment and kind of give the short story of who you are and why you're here, and then I'll do the same. And then as other folks join in, they'll do likewise.
Sure. So I have a PhD from the University of Florida, and I taught Latin there for 7 years. And then after I graduated, I taught Greek and Roman history there and Latin and Roman history at the University of North Florida. And then this will be my third year now teaching at a private for-profit preparatory school in the Orlando area. And I teach Latin 2, Latin 3, IB1, and IB2. And then there are two teachers in the middle school who do a foundations class and a Latin 1 class. So I'm, at the top end of the spectrum. And we definitely have been playing around with the idea of doing a lot more CI. I think I'm the person that's like the most into this idea, but they kind of have to be with me a little bit so that it's not really awkward. But we have decided to ditch our textbook Ecce Romani and kind of write our own stories and things like that based on the cultural content that is laid out in the National Latin Exam curriculum. And we're definitely, the hardest part for me is that I still need the best students to be IB ready to get 5s, 6s, and 7s, because that is how I'm judged as an instructor.
Oh, sure, of course, because when there's, sorry, can you guys hear me? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I had some weird feedback just now. Yeah, anytime that you have the big thing at the end, whether it's IB or whether it's AP, that's obviously a factor. The nice thing about your situation is it sounds like, with the size of the program and the sheer number of teachers and the number of years that they have to prepare, you should be able to get them really to an excellent point and do a better job with that than the textbooks do. I mean, Ecce Romani is what it is. We all know it. Many of us have been stuck in that ditch for a very long time. And,
luckily, that one of the other teachers deals with the ditch. I get them once they're finally in Rome. But
yes, it's what, like a 5 or 6 day journey, right? But yet it takes a whole year to get from there, and that ditch. So my story. I'm Justin Schwam, and I have taught Latin from 1 and before 1 through AP and beyond in North Carolina, and then online for, goodness gracious sakes, 23 years. And for much of that time, I used, all the various textbooks that were out there. Cambridge was one that I used for a long time, but I have certainly used Ecke and looked in and tutored a kid who came in from an Oxford program, and had kids use Latin for Americans and Jenny and everything else that there is out there. But over time, I realized that it was kind of the same journey that you're on, Brenda. That textbooks don't work as well with kids now as they once did, and I don't know that they ever worked well for a lot of kids. I've worked with kids who were very, very advantaged, and kids who were very, very disadvantaged, and kids from generational rural poverty, and kids from generational urban poverty, and everywhere in between, and Americans and Jenny and everything else that there is out there. But
something weird just happened with my audio.
That it was kind of the same journey that you're on, Brenda.
What happened?
I know what happened.
With you?
Yeah, we're still together.
Huh.
It's because you're not using a headset.
Okay.
And so you're getting a little bit of audio delay and feedback. If you mute when you're not talking, it'll go away.
Where is that option?
And if you take hold of the mouse and kind of bring the mouse up near the top of the screen, a little toolbar will pop up. And the second option over from the left is a microphone with a slash through it.
Got it.
Got it. There we go. So yeah, then if that starts again, just hit the mute button and it'll go away. And then when you want to talk, just unmute and we'll see, and we will join in. I'm going to check on the Facebook group and make sure that nobody is desperately asking for a link, but since I gave them the link, that shouldn't be an issue. Great. Yay. So anyway, to continue with my story, in 5 or 6 years ago, I had this one Latin 2 class of wonderful, wonderful kids who they hated the book, and anything that we did in the book, they did in the most quick, partial, bad way possible. But still they wanted a good grade, so they would do it, but they just did it badly. And eventually I said to them, guys, what is it? Why is it that with everything else you do this really high quality job, but with anything that relates to anything in the book, like reading a story in the book and whatever what it is, you just rush through it? They said, well, we hate textbooks. And I said, well, why do you hate textbooks? And they said, I said, is it something about this one in particular? They said, no, we just hate textbooks in general in all of our classes because they're flat and dead and artificial. And I thought, you guys are right. Longtime viewers of this have heard my story about how I said, do you want to see one that's worse? And they said, no. But I made them look at one that was worse. And they said, okay, that one was worse, but, couldn't we do something better? And of course, better meant creating our own stories together and moving away from the textbook. And it really does work better. But it also changes everything about the class. And you can't continue to assess in the same old tired way that you did when, there was, well, okay, so the textbook probably had some extra passages that you could use, and so you used those, and you might have built a test around it. The textbook may have had one of those lovely textbook-based test generators that will make the 100-question multiple choice. I hate those, but people sometimes get desperate and they sometimes use them. I have been guilty of using them for my makeup testing and things. And anyway, but after having gone down the de-textbooking route for several years, I realized, no, you can't do the same old, you can't do a 21st century set of instructional techniques with 20th century assessment techniques. So that was kind of scary, because then what do you do? So before I tell everybody what I do, I'm wondering, Brenda, what you do. And I'm going to turn the microphone off so that I don't have feedback from you.
Okay, so this will be my first year trying to follow this new model. So I'll talk about the last 2 years when I was on Ecce Romani. About once a week, I would take the words from the Ecce Romani list that I thought were actually the most helpful, because I didn't really think they needed to know the word for a light two-wheeled chariot. And I would put all of those words on a list, and they needed to, learn that vocabulary, full dictionary entry to be able to produce it. And I would give them text with the words bolded that I wanted them to produce the entry for, on the idea that they're going to be using all this vocabulary in context, so me just giving them a random list and then finishing it wasn't too helpful, and that the context might help spur some of their memory. And I would give them morphology quizzes, and then twice a quarter they would have a translation test where they would see one passage that we had read and one that was about, the same basic stuff with similar vocabulary, but that was a different story. And I would often get those out of the Ecce Romani workbook or their test book, or I would just kind of make it up, or I would take it from a later chapter and I would remove the structures that they didn't know. And that was kind of, the system that we were in, and we would do a lot of translation in class, students working by themselves or us putting it on the screen and working through it together. And very much better than the way I learned Latin, which was grammar first, reading afterthought, but still I'm thinking from all the things that I've been reading and talking with Miriam and Rachel, who I actually taught when they were grad students at UF, about what they do, that this isn't really helping my students as much as it could, and that they're not learning the way that I learned. Like, learning Latin as a code worked just fine for me, but I can see that it's not working for them. And I've taught Latin for 10 years now with college students and high school students, and I can tell it works with some of them, but it doesn't work for all of them.
Yeah, that was pretty much, again, my experience too, was that learning Latin as a code worked just fine for me. And somehow I transitioned to being able to read and understand it. But I figured out very, very quickly when I was a young teacher that Latin as code wasn't going to work for most of my students. And so, then you start on the journey away from that. And then after about I had this beautiful system that worked really well. Pick a textbook and it would work for a really long time. Pick a reading method textbook and you sort of construct some additional grammatical stuff around it. And it was beautiful and I loved it and the kids loved it. Then all of a sudden, 6 or 7 years ago, everything changed and nothing worked anymore. And it still worked for a few kids, but I had more and more kids for whom, even that wasn't working. And then I started started farther down the CI road and discovered, the same things. That's exciting that you taught Rachel and Miriam. That's wonderful. They are such an inspiration. I love them. But I remember, having conversations with folks at the ACL Institute, and we were all noticing this and, trying to figure out what to do and experimenting with different things. And so then, all sorts of things happen. My friend Ann Martin and I developed, based on that conversation with that set of students of mine who said that textbooks are horrible because they're flat, dead, and artificial, we developed the Trace Alumni Project. And if you haven't seen it, here's the link to the current version. In fact, I will do a quick screen share because I realize that for folks who are watching, they can't see the chat window that we can see if we're in the live Hangout. So for you folks, here is the Trace Alumni Project in its current version. And here is if we were going to do this, here is a sample introduction to a set of readings. And here is the first story that could see and hear with Anne's wonderful audio. And I could go on and talk about Discipline all day, but I won't because that's not really what we're here for. But the idea was to build a resource around CI techniques that then you could add to and subtract from and do all those kinds of things so that we had a spine. And then, of course, the idea was and remains that student participants create stories too. So they can add characters, they can use existing characters, they can build off of existing storylines, they can retell stories, they can do all kinds of things like that as their proficiency grows. And that's kind of the thing that sets apart what we do from some CI approaches that are really about just entirely teacher-directed input. Excuse me, but I also have a cat who's suddenly decided that she really needs attention. So if you hear some purring in the background or see a little orange head, that's what that is. Anyway, the dog has decided he's not interested today. Usually he wants to be very involved, but not today. So the cat, it's her turn. Anyway, and both of them have featured the dog more so in disguise in stories that kids have created, then we created with kids and whatnot. But assessment, how does assessment work in that kind of a system? Well, for a long time I had no idea. I mean, we were de-textbooking, but not really knowing what to do next. And we tried all kinds of different things, from sort of conventional reading comprehension tests and story creation activities and different kinds of, retaining vocabulary work, and obviously, the occasional sort of specific grammar point focused quiz, and we tried everything under the sun. But eventually it came to be that I learned about the actual integrated performance assessment, and I'm very grateful to the World Languages curriculum coordinator in the district where I was working at the time, who said, okay guys, this is the wave of the future. We're all going to be doing this eventually, so we might as well start learning about it now. Brenda, how much, if anything, do you know about like the actual standards and the IPA?
Well, I know a little bit about the ACTFL standards because in my world languages department, that's what the Spanish, French, and Mandarin teachers use. But we in Latin have different standards that we wrote ourselves, but now I'm already like, I wish we had done these differently. It's because the idea of dealing with like the interpersonal and the interpretive and stuff like that is the presentational, I guess. The interpretive is the easy part. It's the presentational and the interpersonal that is a little scary for me, I guess, to figure out how to bring that stuff in my classroom and how to hold my students accountable for it. And I'm new to trying to use Latin orally in class for things other than basic readings and basic directions. So, that discomfort, which I'm totally willing to address, but it makes it hard to think about assessment. And I kind of need to get that all sort of laid out. The IPA is something I've heard mentioned within the group, but I don't really quite have my head wrapped around how you do this. And at my school, there's a very grade grubby culture that we've been trying to get away from with different grading strategies. We have reassessment policies now, and we are moving towards standards-based grading, and the lower school does it entirely, but in the middle and upper school, that's still tied to an old-fashioned 100% point grade book, and our grades are reported to the families and to the colleges by percent instead of by letter grade. So, it's not enough to just get the A. They don't want it to say whatever it is, I guess 89.5. They want to see these better percentage numbers. So we're really tied to this grady culture that makes it hard for me to understand how I implement rubrics and turn those into percents and deal with a student who's like, yeah, well, this 3 is an 85, but if it was an 86.5, my grade would be the 93.5 I need for a full A instead of an A minus. The kids get very grady. So that's kind of where I am with all of this.
Oh, that sounds like my story. I spent a long time at one school that had just a very, very grady culture that was encouraged by the faculty, which was really unfortunate. And we tried to get away from it. We did have some success. And actually using the integrated performance assessment, which was a thing that my Spanish colleague and I really worked on together. We developed a grading system together. We developed a whole bunch of things together. And it really made a difference, partly because with the integrated performance assessment, I mean, yes, there's a number, yes, there's a rubric, and yes, the rubric turns into a number, but we gave a lot of thought to where we put the numbers. And the other thing that we did was to, to say, okay, well, if you're here and you want the higher number, well, okay, you're here, you're at this point, but that means you need to get to that point. So let's look at how we can do that. In fact, I'm going to grab a document and show you it. Let's see if it's over here. It should be. No, it's not. Because of course it's not, because I didn't open it. Sorry, but it's here. Oh, here we go. Okay, now that it's open, now we can do the screen share. I hate to have people watching me select a document and screen share it and do all those things. So anyway, also for some reason I have a sinus headache going on, so I apologize in advance if I'm a little bit, but
not a problem.
Anyway, so here is a sample of a document that I use early in Latin 1, whether they're with kids in a physical classroom or I work with some school districts virtually now, and then I also have a wonderful, wonderful group of homeschoolers who aren't really grade focused, because if the family wants a final grade, we can give them a final grade, but if they don't, then we can really just focus on learning. Hang on just a second.
Tinkerbell. Which Tinkerbell do you want? Am I, can you hear me? Sorry,
yeah, I remember those days. And yay, Eleanor's here as always. Good to see you. So I was just sharing with Brenda a document that you've seen that is a sample of one of these sort of small-scale integrated performance assessments. And an integrated performance assessment at its nature takes a cultural topic the students explore in a series of the instructional activities, and then at the culmination of that, they do, for a full-scale one, they do an interpretive task. So they, for our purposes, would normally read something, or in a modern language class you can watch something or listen to something too, and then they do some kind of interpersonal activity with it, and then they make some kind of a product that is a presentational activity. What I figured out that I could do when I was teaching in physical classrooms in North Carolina uses the actual standards for all world languages, but they say that while you certainly use interpersonal activities in a Latin classroom, that they need not be formally assessed and graded. So, oh, excuse me just a second. Because nobody should hear me sneeze. That is a scary sound. The cat and the dog would both be running if I were sneezing right now. But anyway, I realized that we could do the interpersonal work informally, and then assess the interpretive task and the presentational task, and then look at how well they were able to incorporate and to use cultural topics. So at any rate, what we do in this one, this is a Roman family sort of a topic that we've been working with for a while, and we've learned about various families and done all sorts of things. So with them, so you'll notice that we're looking at 3 strands with interpretation, presentation, and culture, and it builds on a prior thing where they created or started to create a quote authentic Roman family. Now, their first Roman families usually aren't very authentic, and then we talk about ways to make them more authentic. So they create their family, and they tell us these things about it. And then they develop an illustrated family tree and a floor plan of their home. And then eventually they and some cuestiones latinae about about their about the family. And the Latin description can be, such and so est pater, such and so, pater in tabellina laborat. It can be very, very formulaic if it needs to be. And then they just create three or so cuestiones about it. So then they share their product, the family tree and the house, and they ask the questions, and everybody else responds to the questions, and that's the whole cycle. And you'll see that there's this rubric here, which this is based on North Carolina's now slowly disappearing 7-point grading scale, effective I believe it's this year. Incoming ninth graders in North Carolina are graded on a 10-point scale, but students who are already in high school are graded on a 7-point scale, and I have no idea how that's going to work, but I'm not working in physical classrooms in North Carolina anymore, so I don't have to worry about it. But my friends who are having to deal with grading and with setting up my friends are having to deal with setting up PowerSchool and other things like that to handle that kind of grading system is just, I don't even want to think about it. But anyway, so here's a culture rubric, and this is, with the 7-point scale, so that a 90 is a mid-range B, and an 80 is a mid-range C, and a 70 is a D-. And then here's presentation, and you'll notice that there really are only two options. You can be at standard with the 90-ish, or you can be above standard, excuse me, with the 100% thing. And then with the interpretation, again, you could be approaching the standard, you could be at it, or you could be above it. So that's kind of a typical and standard way that I go about using the IPA structure and using the actual standards to make that kind of thing happen. Well, here is an example from a Latin 2 class with a district that I was working with remotely last year. They're up. Let me see if I can find it as I say that. Rubric 4. Well, maybe it would help. Oh, here's one. Yeah. This is near the end of Latin 2, like the third quarter of Latin 2. And notice, once again, we've got the normal standards and strands. They're focusing on the Virtutis Romani, specifically on Pietas and Dignitas and Gravitas, but certainly on any of the others. They're creating a story or summary based on the experiences of a character that they read about in a whole series of stories. And now we've got a more complex rubric, and I'm looking at what level of interpretive proficiency did you demonstrate. The target of not as high. Looking at can you integrate what you know about Roman cultural products, practices, and perspectives, or any two of them, or just one of them, or okay, you clearly know something but you couldn't really integrate it. And were you able to reach this particular group? I had not worked with them in Latin 1. Their teacher in Latin 1 told them that nobody knows how Latin is pronounced, so there's no need to ever say it or hear it. So we had some work to do with the presentational mode, which they were very willing to do. They were a wonderful group. And also the great thing is that we rescued that program by working with them remotely for a year, and grew it to the point that they were able to hire a full-time teacher, which they'd never had before. So I'm happy to hand them off to her, although I will miss them. But I think that we'll be in touch. So anyway, so their target level at that point was novice mid presentational. Some of them were getting to the point of novice high, so I have that description. And by the end of the year, a lot of them were getting up towards approaching intermediate low presentational work. They could write a series of connected Latin sentences that weren't necessarily, totally grammatical, but were again, we're right there where you might want them to be. And all of them were solidly, able to write phrases and sentences, which I really thought spoke to the kind of work that they had done, because, in the beginning, they really didn't think that you could write anything in Latin other than, you could write a conjugation chart or a declension chart, but that's what they had done. So I was really, really proud of them and wanted to brag on them a little bit, just because of the fact that they had done all of these things. I've got some examples of their work too, if people would like to see it. So yay, Ellie is back in her right form, and so Ellie meet Brenda, and Brenda meet Ellie, and let's see. Ellie, do you have anything that you would like to say? I may be summarizing what we talked about yesterday, or building off of what I just said before we go on and kind of take it to the next level.
I don't have anything in particular to say about yesterday. I think it was great. I got a lot out of it, so I hope people will listen to it and not listen to me, but listen to it. It's very useful. Brenda, I got the impression from your Facebook post that you were looking for specifically CI-based assessments. Is that true still? Okay, so I haven't actually taught CI yet. I feel like I should say that. I've only taught high school Latin for 1 year. I taught college Latin before, and that was very non-CI. That was very grammar. But I have been reading a lot and trying to figure out how CI actually works, and I've done the 3-day TPRS workshop and things. So maybe I have some ideas that hopefully will be, if not new to you, at least hearing them together, they will be more useful. So in terms of CI assessments, a lot of it, what I'm kind of struggling with is so much of it is informal. It's not on paper. A lot of it is going to be stuff like watching their eyes during class if you're doing a TPRS, seeing who's understanding, seeing who needs you to go over something again, seeing who's bored and wants to move ahead. But that obviously is not going to cut it if we need to have 3 examples of formative assessments and 6 examples of summative assessments, and they all have to, anyway, evaluations. So some of the things you can do on paper are a dictatio. That is a good thing. You can read about that on the Best Practices blog or on Keith Toda's blog. Those are both good. Another thing is any kind of comprehension check you can do. So that can be something that you do out loud, or it can be something written, like you could have a bunch of true or false questions. One of the jobs that Ben Slavic suggests for TPRS classrooms, because he's very big on classroom jobs, is to have a student, ideally one of the more advanced students within the class, have that student responsible for coming up with quiz questions during the story. So they don't have to be complex. It just has to be, if the story is Keith wants an elephant, you ask who wants an elephant, that kind of thing. They can also be true or false. So you kind of have a student coming up with the questions, which gives everybody a little bit more trust in the whole quiz system. The other thing, one thing that Ben Slavic emphasizes a lot is having them do some kind of quick quiz or at least exit ticket, something like every day, because oddly, the more assessments you take, the less of a big deal they are. So our kids are overwhelmed with all kinds of MCAS, and that's what Massachusetts has, standardized testing and whatever. And they're all kind of, they think a test is a big scary thing. And I actually found last year that I only gave 4 tests in 4 quarters. That's total, 4 tests, because I never felt like we're ready for another big unit test. So for CI, for this year, I'm kind of planning on trying to do a lot more smaller quizzes, smaller tests that focus on one skill or one structure or one day's worth of work to kind of try and get have a much more micro level idea of how they're doing. Let's see, another good assessment to do is timed writes and free writes. You can do those. Those are probably both timed or not. It depends. Keith Toda has a distinction between the two of them. I don't know if it matters. But you give them 10 minutes or whatever to write as much as they can on a topic. So that topic can be retell the story we did today, or it can be tell me about your pet, or whatever, any kind of free write that they could do at their level. And that shows you what they've been able to put together from that day, what kind of grammar and stuff they've internalized to the point of being able to reproduce it. And possibly more importantly, it also shows you where the sticking points are, because their output, the things they write and speak, is always going to be behind what they can understand. So if they understood the story perfectly clearly, but they don't reproduce it perfectly, they have a couple errors here and there, that shows you where the sticking points are. So I guess just a couple things. Dictatio, which you do over and over and you kind of correct. I would read up on that. Timed writes and free writes. True and false things. Have the kids make up quizzes during the story. And then anything you can do if you want to do vocab quizzes and you want to make them more comprehensible and kind of get away from just like, here are 6 English words, what are the Latin words? You can have it in context. You can have like a little story in English or in Latin where they have to fill in the right word, and you could have a picture underneath the blank. Like if the story was Keith wants an elephant, you'd have Keith wants a blank, or Keith blank Woluit, whatever. It's past tense now, with a little picture of an elephant under the line. That's something you can do. And yeah, that's sort of what I've come up with off the top of my head. I hope that's some ideas.
On the vocabulary, with an example like that, would you then, like, if the kid puts, elephantus, but they should have put elephantum, would you just like ignore the grammatical error because you're checking the vocabulary skill there? Like, I mean, correct it perhaps, but not deduct. Okay.
One of the things that I've heard about, and I don't know whether this is from CI or what, but I did a little course on second language acquisition, and one thing that we read up on was how error correction affects learning. And it seems that actually, if you are correcting, it should be not us, not us. They're not. I mean, you've probably seen students. They take their paper that's all marked up, and they look at the top for the grade, and then they crumple it up and throw it on your floor. So correcting like that doesn't actually seem to work super well. So what I have heard suggested instead is correct whenever the mistake interferes with meaning. So on a vocab test, it's, did he write some form of elephantus or no? Yes, no. He wrote elephantus, good. He wrote canis, no. If you're doing something, if you want to test, do they understand inflection, then maybe you'd have the sentence, Keith elephantum voluit, and then you'd say, who wanted an elephant? Or what did Keith want? Or who wanted what? Or something like that. So have them identify the subject and the direct object, not as what is the subject, what is the direct object, what is nominative, what is accusative, but rather as who's the one doing the wanting, who's the one getting wanted. And that's something that I did a little bit last year, just because I found that using subject and direct object and transitive verb and intransitive verb was just like teaching an extra foreign language in between English and Latin, and it just terrified my students when they couldn't hold on to it. So what I've read about second language acquisition suggests that kind of thing, you want to do error correction only for things that interfere with meaning, and you want to try to phrase the questions in a comprehensible way. Right? Asking what the subject is not comprehensible to a lot of students. And then the other thing was, when you find errors like that, from what I was reading about error correction, it's important to look at them not as my student doesn't understand that accusative endings happen, but as, okay, my student understands that this word means elephant, but does not yet understand this part. So in his world, his construction of Latin, the words don't change endings, and treat it not as an error, but as a description of what that student knows already. He knows that Latin has different vocab, but he maybe doesn't get the endings changing yet. I can send you an article or something on that if you like, because I thought that was really interesting, and it really changed the way I look at grading. So I'll post an article to the folder at some point. Yeah, that was a long answer to a short question.
Oh, it's an excellent answer, and it's a really important point. I think one of the things that I said at the very beginning as folks were arriving was talking about how changing our perspective on assessment changes everything else that we do. And if you focus on assessment as finding students' mistakes, then that creates one kind of a class. But if you say instead, I'm looking at what they can do, that creates a very different kind of a class. And like the big scale things like the IPA are really focused on what students can do, and it changes everything, because no longer are people whining about the fact that they made an 86.5, and if only they'd made an 87.3, that would make all the difference. They're saying, oh, okay, look at the things that I can do. And particularly, if you have those kinds of rubrics like the ones that I was showing folks earlier, then you can look, okay, this is where I am. And then the rubric, the description of the next level is there. So you can say, okay, this is where I'm going. My next step is to be able to understand not just words and phrases, but also, words, phrases, and simple sentences. And then to understand main ideas and some details. I mean, that's a big jump. But you can see how once you understand words, phrases, and sentences, that it's not that big of a jump to main ideas and details. So I'm really glad that you said that about error correction, and yes, I would love for that article. If you could share it and stick it over there, because I think so many people don't know that stuff about error correction and language acquisition, and it's really, really important.
It's also just literally the exact opposite of how I learned to teach Latin, which is just mind blowing. But it made so much sense once I read about it.
Yeah, and definitely I taught in college for 8 years, so I definitely am very used to like a kind of, I guess we would say, like an old-fashioned approach and marking things wrong. And one thing that, even though the IB program is still in Latin focused on, like there's a whole section that's on site translation of either Ovid or Cicero, which is just like a skill way above even a really awesome high school student. They do focus very much on the student earning points instead of losing points. And so that's something that I started doing in my classroom a lot from the beginning as a high school teacher, was like you're earning 5 points for conveying the meaning and some of the grammar accurately, instead of like you're losing 1 because you didn't convey this one grammatical point. You used passive voice instead of active or something like that. So
yeah, that's a thing that I started doing too, even before I had discovered all these other things. I remember, and it was just such a simple thing. I had realized that what I wanted for my students on this particular reading comprehension check was I wanted them to find 20 significant details, because the thing was worth 20 points. I mean, so it made sense that they'd find 20 correct significant details. And I told them, if you find 20 correct significant details in your answers to questions 1, 2, and 3, you're done. That's fine. If it takes you all the way to question number 10, that's fine too. However many you find. And I said, so what I will do when I'm grading them is I'll write the number, a little check mark for the correct, and then the number of significant details that you found that were right in answer to that question. And I mean, I started doing that probably 9 or 10 years ago, and that was the only change that I made it to what had previously been, sort of a very grade and point focused system. And it changed everything, because then my high flyers, if they didn't feel like reading the whole story, would know, okay, well, how many things I've found? I've found 5 things, 20 of them I know are right, I can stop. And then the kids who couldn't find that much detail would just keep going, and they'd find the details they could find. And it really changed everything. It was exciting. Then I was able to kind of transition away from that. But it really, then we tried various kinds of reading comprehension games where, you found that, and I would say, okay, this is the number of details that you found, and this is the number of details that you found. And I kind of led naturally to the focus on what type of detail what types of details can you find in the more holistic form of assessment. But I think that's a great way to move towards it, is just to focus on the points earned, to say, okay, well, you found this, you found that, you found that. So I'm excited to know that I'm not the only person who has ever done that. It looks like Brenda had to step away. Yes, to get daughter some water. I understand that. She's back, yay! Oh, I remember those days of having to get the little ones some water, and now the little ones are 18 and 13, and Miss 18 just finished her first week in college, and I haven't heard much from her, so I figure that's probably a good sign that her first week at Chapel Hill was good enough that she was not constantly texting me. She said I texted her on the first day and said, how are things? And she said, oh, they're good. And I texted her on Thursday and said, how are things? She said, well, it's really good, and I'm glad I only have one class tomorrow. And I sent her a text on Friday that said, congratulations on finishing your first week, and I have heard nothing back from her, so I figure that's probably a really good sign. So before you know it, little Miss Water is going to be in college, and then what will happen?
I'm definitely not ready to think about her growing up yet, so. I'm getting used to this muting and unmuting thing.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I mean, it may not end up being a problem for you, but sometimes when you don't have headphones, what will happen is that the audio out from the speakers feeds back into the microphone, and that's what causes the delay.
Okay, I said this in chat, but just in case you can't see it, I have added an article by Quarter. It's from 1967, so you can see how much impact it's had in its time, on error correction. I included my notes on it, which are not super substantial, but they'll give you an idea. And then I also included a note in my notes, too, for further reading. Look at the book, How Language by Lightbound and Spada. It's a very, very comprehensive book and really useful for looking at second languages from the point of view of what do we know about how first languages are learned and how can we relate that and everything. It's a very useful book, so I recommend picking it up or stealing it from a library. Don't steal it. Borrowing it from a library if you can. But definitely check out that Quarter article. It's an easy read considering it's an academic article too.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I'm glad that it's there. I'm so glad that you put it there, because it is a thing that people just don't know. I mean, as a profession, it's like we've missed 30 or 40 or 50 years of pedagogical development, and then all of a sudden we've started catching up, because Latin teachers using CI and using those kinds of techniques are ahead of teachers of a lot of other languages, as we discover when we get to places like NTPRS, and then the folks don't know what we're doing, and then they discover what we're doing, and it's like, oh, you're doing that.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't be too down on ourselves as a profession for being behind the research, because an awful lot of teachers are working on research that's 20 or 30 years old as well, just because of inertia, really. So, whatever we can do to pick it up. Another thing on assessments that I found really useful to read was Bob Patrick wrote an article that he was about sort of the basics of doing CI in a Latin class. It was linked here and there right after ACL, but last I checked, the link was dead. So I believe it's going to be published at some point in the CamWiz journal TCL. It's an online journal. It's free, teaching classical languages. So bookmark that and keep an eye on it, and his article should show up eventually. I could be wrong about that, but I'll try and find my copy of it and upload it to that folder as well.
Oh, that'll be great. That will be wonderful. Because Bob is really, I think, one of the people in our field who really keeps up with that research better than just about anybody else. So that will be one. I'm looking forward to that. I remember reading it when it was on the blog. I'm glad that it's going to be shared in a wider and more well-known venue. Although I was sad that it was gone when I looked for it the other day and it wasn't. Well, gosh, we've covered a lot of territory in a fairly short amount of time. Yesterday we talked a great deal about formative assessments and the kind of little daily low stakes to no stakes things that can give you a read on how students are doing, and can also kind of change the culture from the grade grubby, why did I lose this quarter point here, to something more positive. And I shared a number of things that I do, but before I do that again or talk about some other things that I do, what are some of the formative assessment things other than well, I mean, we talked about exit tickets, but what are some other things that you guys have used that have worked well?
Well, so keeping in mind that I was on a fully reading grammar approach before, I was doing things like with my students after we had read a story in Ecce Romani, the next class, so that usually they'd have 2 days to work on it in class. In the next class, I would do something like a Socrative quiz where they would have to answer comprehension questions about the story, instead of me actually picking up their translations and checking for word accuracy, because that's impossible to do with a bunch of students. It's just an endless amount of work. Plus, I don't, we were talking about before, correcting their errors on that stuff never meant anything to them, especially since it was homework. They completely ignored it. And then I would, for vocabulary, after I presented the vocabulary and they'd had some time with it, I would tell them, to study the nouns and then to study the verbs, or however I would have it broken up. And then I would have them come in the next day, and their class warm-up would be something like a Socrative, just to check association with the Latin word to the English meaning. And then on their actual summative assessment would be more like producing the full dictionary entry correct or close to correctly. Things like that. We would make, sometimes I would give them, I would create, when we did relative pronouns and interrogative pronouns, I made the charts on a giant spreadsheet, and I cut them all up, and so there was all these little puzzle pieces, and put them in groups, and I gave them all of the charts all mixed together, and then they would be timed and compete against the other groups in the class, so who could make the relative pronoun chart the fastest, and who could make the interrogative pronoun chart the fastest, and then at the end who could make them all the fastest. So those are the kind of formative activities that I was doing.
Yeah, that sounds really good. They love the online quiz things like Socrative and Kahoot, and mine asked for them more and more. They were like, "We don't care what you make the quiz about. Let's just do it." Okay. And also having them actually manipulate paper charts and things is just excellent too. One thing I thought of while you were talking about what you did after the story, by having a Socrative quiz, something you can do in a district where not everybody has a phone, or just for fun, for a change, is you can have kids draw something. So have them draw what they think happened in the story, or give them some sentences from a story and have them draw it. And that's kind of a fun thing to do, because sometimes it makes it very clear that they don't understand what's going on. But other times they have fun with it. I had mine were reading one of the last stories in the Cambridge Latin Unit 1, so it was about Pompeii. So they all got to draw people who were on fire and things, and carrying the sick guy to the temple, and they had a good time with that. But having students draw what they understand seems to be a really good way to get them to show you what they understand without that nasty medium of a quiz or here are some comprehension questions, which just ends up being a sort of hunting for the right answer within the text. So I really liked having them draw things. And I have now added the Bob Patrick article to the mentoring group materials folder. It's in the CI/TPRS folder. Okay.
Well, great. Thank you for that. I definitely want to read that. Another activity that I did that worked really well, and I only did this once because I did it late in the year, and it's something that I think I could do again this year, even though the class focus is changing, is to give them a story with the sentences just randomly, and they have to, a story they don't know, and they have to kind of, comprehend it enough to put the story in order in the correct way, put all those pieces back together. I'm trying to think of what other fun activities we did that engage them with the Latin at a level of understanding instead of just linguistic perfection of translation, because that's
that
perfectly
sentence one sounds really good.
Yeah.
And I've seen similar ones where they'll have you provide them with pictures, ideally pictures that they drew in previous classes, and have them rearrange them into the right order to go with the story. So you can do that as well.
Yeah, that does sound like fun. I think getting them to see things is always helpful. Sometimes we would do that with vocab too. I would put up images, and they'd have to figure out what vocab word I was representing, and that would be fun. A higher level thing I would do with my students, and for some of them it was a lot of fun, and for other ones they just found it endlessly frustrating, was I would give them they had to write a sentence and they had to meet certain requirements. They had to use two of the following 3 vocab words, and they had to use a prepositional phrase, and they had to use an adjective, but they had a lot of freedom in what they wrote, and then we would share them. Their friends would try to read them.
Oh, I really like that. And Sully Allen, yay, Alan is here. A thing that I just realized I've never talked about in any of these Hangouts that my students love is an idea that I think I got originally from the old Cambridge workbooks. I'm not sure if it's in the new ones or not, but there would periodically be those pictures, and you had to find as many Latin words as possible that were relevant to what was in the picture. Well, of course, once Tres Columnae came along, and we had the amazing illustrations that Lucy Martin did for us for the earlier lectiones, then it occurred to me to do something like that, and I would just grab a picture, and it would be projected at the beginning of class, and the challenge was for you as a pair or an individual or a group of 3 or whatever to come up with as many words as possible relevant to whatever the picture was, and it would be a picture that had accompanied a fairly recent story. Yay, bring us back. So we would, and then there was a little bit of competition to see who could come up with the most words, and people realized, oh yeah, you could have verbs as well as nouns if the person is sitting or whatever, and it's amazing what you learn about what kids do and don't remember from an activity like that. It's an excellent way to sort of informally assess vocabulary retention. Then I know the other day I described the vocabulary reflection and organizer, which I won't again because we've all seen that, except to give props to my friend Emily Lewis in Virginia, who came up with the idea and shared it with me and allowed me to steal it. But it's a thing that my students just seem to universally love, the idea of classifying words as being, I think these are going to be important. These I know really well. These I don't know so well, so can we focus on them a little bit in the next week or so? And then these I can see connections, I can see derivatives, I can see connections to Spanish or to French or to, whatever. That's why the chemical symbol for lead is Pb. I get it now. And so rather than, the teacher spending all the time making those connections for the kids get to make connections for themselves, which I think is very, very powerful. Alan, Soleil, since you're here, and since Alan and Brenda haven't officially met in these Hangouts, could you just say a word or two about your story and where you are on the journey towards assessment?
Sure. So, hi, Brenda. Nice to meet you. Sorry I showed up late. I was listening the whole time, but I had some cleaning to do. and I didn't think you'd want to watch me do that. Um, so in terms of assessment, I'm actually not in the classroom right now. I'm back doing some graduate work, but I taught for several years at some suburban high schools. Um, my big favorite assessment is the sort of IPA model. I think it's very holistic. You get a lot from it. And I talked a bit about it yesterday, but just in listening to the conversation today and thinking about more hands-on written things, I really like Justin's idea with a photo. I've done something similar. I didn't give them a picture. I just gave them a category of words, let's say animals, and just had them list as many as they could. Relevant to that, that's one good way to do vocab. Having them draw stuff is great because it shows comprehension really well without them having to resort to English. I'm a big fan of synonyms, and that's harder for the younger students and the kids just getting started because they have such a small vocabulary. But once they're a bit along the way, synonyms, antonyms, word relationships are a really great way to assess vocab while staying in Latin. I like the closed tests. One thing I like to do with more advanced students is give them a list of words and grammatical structures and a known story and tell them to retell the story to me using those words and grammatical structures. That's a really good way to get them composing. Yeah, that's really the stuff that I do most of or have done most with. One thing I do when I do written assessment is I try to write a text that is a story. I've done it based off a couple different textbooks, so something usually as an offshoot story to the chapter involving the textbook characters, and then when I want them to do something with grammar, I'll underline a part of the story and say, write this in a different way. So maybe they get quia something something, and they could write it as an ablative absolute. So I'll underline it and say, write this as an ablative absolute. Or write this with a gerund or a gerundive or whatever needs to happen. And when I do it that way, I can also do vocabulary at the same time. So for the italicized word, give me a synonym, give me an antonym. Say it differently. And that way it's one assessment happening in the context of a story, as opposed to chunks of different things. The easiest way I've found to do that, if anyone's interested, is actually with footnotes. So I just write the story, and each question is a footnote to it, and that's where their answer space goes. But I like that a lot. And then, I mean, really, it's as creative as you want to be when it comes to CI. Anything that has them giving you feedback is great. One thing I did want to chime in on now that I'm here, listening to your conversation about error correction, is a concept called U-shaped behavior. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but what happens when you learn a language? And you have a daughter, right? I think that's what I caught. So you're familiar with this, you just don't know it. When people learn a language, they acquire a particular structure early, and they use it well. But then as they learn more of the language, their use in it dips. They start making mistakes. And then at the end, competency reappears. The classic example in English with this is irregular past tense. So you see things like slept, right? And a little kid, when they first learn it, will say slept all the time. But then once they start to figure out the ED rule for regular past tense, they say I sleeped. And you see that dip. But then it comes back and they say slept, and this is very familiar, and it happens in Latin too. And one of the dangers of looking at error correction and trying to, mark all of the missed accusatives and things like that is depending on where students fall in their U-shaped behavior pattern for that concept, it might not be that they don't not know it, if that makes any sense the way I just phrased it. They might totally get it, but in the process of what you're asking them to do, their understanding of the rule, they're overcorrecting. They're trying to apply something that doesn't work there. And so you get a false positive on what they really know anyway. And one advantage to CI assessment, like the timed writes, is because you take the pressure off and they're constantly generating. You can see and track that behavior with them and get a much better picture than you would on just one test or quiz assessment. So I feel like I just dumped for like 3 minutes, maybe more, lots of things. So I'll shut up now. But that's sort of where I'm at. Exactly. That's a great example. Applying the first declension ending pattern to a third declension noun. You see a lot of that with U-shaped behavior, especially also fourth and second declensions, right? They're really close. So they over-apply those rules, or forgetting the neuter in the second declension. It crops up a lot. So just being aware of that, I think, is really key to monitoring student success and performance, and recognizing that it might not be a lack of knowledge. It could just be a natural part of the acquisition process.
And I think that is such a powerfully important thing. And it is something that, as teachers, we tend to forget, even though it applies, I mean, not just to language acquisition, it applies to everything. You know, when you're learning to play a musical instrument at the beginning, you know what well, even if you're just learning to play a piece, and you've decided on, or if you're a beginner, you know, here's the fingering for this particular piece. And you do that right at the beginning, and then when you're sort of in the middle of hacking your way through learning the piece, it all goes out the window. And you're doing this thing and you're thinking, why am I even doing this? Well, it's because of the way that works. And it, you know, being aware of it, and I think sharing it with students too, and saying, you know, have you ever, when you were learning something new, just felt like everything was really falling apart for a little while before it came together? To say that to kids is very, very helpful, because then when it starts happening to them, they don't panic. And that's another way that we can, it's not a direct assessment kind of a thing, but it's related to assessment, and it does change the culture of the class from the feeling of, you know, oh, you know, mean old Mr. Schwab has had to get you because here was this thing and I knew how to do it last week and now I can't do it and he's taking off points. Well, no, you know, it was just completely inevitable that that would happen. And it's okay. And I think that the more that we can help kids see, and it's okay, the more powerful, you know, it is for their learning.
I think that's a really great point, Justin, about communicating some of this to students. Whenever I have a new set of students, whether they're new to Latin or just new to me, I take a lesson, more or less, depending on the school schedule, and I just talk to them at their level about these sorts of language learning phenomena so they understand what's happening, and that's made a world of difference in both their confidence, as you said, and performance, for exactly the reasons you noted, Justin, that when they hit that slump, they know already that it's just this thing that happens when you learn language, and not to worry about it. Just keep practicing, keep doing our work, and we'll get through it. But being explicit with them about that theory also, I think, lets them, and other language learning theories, lets them self-monitor and study a little bit better, since they're not doing things that don't seem to align well with language acquisition in general.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I think that helping kids find good study techniques that work for their particular processing style and that work with what we know about language acquisition. Suddenly I can talk again. That's really important, and it's a thing that, you know, is sort of at the heart of what we ought to be doing as teachers, right? Because it's kind of what we're there for, but we don't always do it. Sometimes, you know, we think there's the one right way, and we're gonna do it that way, or we want everybody to do it our way because it worked for us, so surely it would work for everybody. I'm reminded of a former colleague of mine at a school I taught at once a long time ago, who she taught French, and she firmly believed that the only way to learn vocabulary required a composition book, but not a spiral notebook, a composition book, and some flashcards. And you had to write the words in the composition book, and you folded the page in a particular way, so that and you quizzed yourself with those first. And then for the words that you were still having trouble with, you made flashcards. And that is the only way to learn vocabulary. Well, of course, it's not the only way to learn vocabulary, but she thought it was the only way to learn vocabulary. And so these poor kids are sitting there, you know, and for many of them, it was like the least efficient way in the world to learn vocabulary. So of course, I thought there was the one right way to learn vocabulary too, for a long time. But I did at least allow kids to either make the list or the cards, and then eventually I realized, no, there are many right ways to learn vocabulary because all of them have to do with repetition of the word, preferably in context, and that's what you do, and that's really how you acquire the words. And if you want to try to give yourself additional repetitions of the word in isolation, you can go ahead, and that can work. But that's not really the most important thing. And I mean, it rocked some kids' worlds when I said, why don't we have your old-fashioned type vocabulary quizzes in the Latin family? And they would say, we don't know. And I would say, well, what happens? Think about the vocabulary quiz in every other class, right? What happens? Well, you study the words, right? And then you take the test or the quiz. And what do you do as you're walking out the door that day? Well, you forget the words, right? Because you've been tested on them. And they looked at me as if, oh my God, he knows. Well, of course I know. I did this too.
That's got to be our greatest frustration as language teachers, is that none of this can go away. They need to learn something, retain it, and keep using it. And they want, every assessment to be independent of every other assessment, and every quarter.
Yep, exactly. Can you guys hear me? Or am I dead?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Yeah, I don't know
I
what.
can hear you now, but Brenda, you were cut off. Was she cut off for anybody else?
Yeah, you were cut off for me for about maybe 20 seconds. So, but I think what you had been saying was that or what I think we all heard was that that kids can't really forget anything in a language class, but of course they want to, and that they want every assessment to be independent and every quarter to stand on its own, et cetera, and that they can't. One of the things that I used to do when I was using textbooks was just simply the fact that that worked for that, and there would be textbook vocabulary lists, and I had made well, when I used Cambridge, I had giant giant flashcards I had made with the words as they appeared, in the vocab list. And so I constructed vocabulary quizzes by picking 10 random words out of the 10 random cards out of that particular set. Oh, excuse me. But the day after we took the regular vocabulary quiz, we started out the day with what we called the vocabulary review quiz, and it was 10 random words, 10 or 20, depending on the year and like our mood and stuff, chosen from the preceding 5 lists. And the idea was and I would pick them just completely at random. I mean, I would literally say, okay, the words from stage 2 are the following. Number 1, number 2. The words from stage 3 are the following. Number 3 and number 4. And I mean, it was kind of a mean thing to do in some ways. But on the other hand, what it did do was it sent the message that you can't forget the old words. Well, of course, we kept seeing the old words. And of course, in any kind of a constructed curriculum, whether it's textbook based or whether you're looking at a Latin frequency list, any of the ones that are out there, obviously the important words are going to keep showing up. I mean, you learned ambulare early in Latin 1, but it continues to show up. You learned forms of wallow early on when he wilt elephantum, but you're still going to be seeing that later on. And whether you do something artificial like that or whether you do something more organic, just to send the message of that this is still important. Yes, accusatives, we learned about them early, but Virgil still uses them in the same place that that the textbook said he was going to, and helping kids grasp that it's not forgotten when it usually is forgotten in other classes, except, well, it's not forgotten in math, except that math teachers just yell when you don't remember. Um, and then, and it's obviously not forgotten if you're an athlete or a musician, you get it because, it's not forgotten there. But if you're not an athlete and you're not a musician and you're not a gamer, because of course gamers can't forget anything that they've learned about that particular game, but if you're not in one of those categories, it can be kind of a challenge to come into a language class and all of a sudden you have to remember old stuff that's already been on the test. And Brenda, yes, it is the never-ending frustration of the math teachers. I have, well, my daughter thinks she might possibly want to teach math for a while. She really wants to do information science because she has loved libraries since she was small, and Chapel Hill has this wonderful information science program. So she's really decided to do that. But she was thinking about maybe also picking up a math education minor. But of course, then I'm thinking about all the math teachers that she had and all the math teachers that I've known, and how frustrated they get when the kid doesn't remember that thing and they know that they did it last year, or last week, or yesterday, and they can't do it, or they don't think that they can still do it. Obviously, with a CI type of an approach, it's less of a challenge just because you keep recycling the things, or with a reading-based textbook that you keep recycling the vocabulary and the structures. But what are some other ways that we can help kids see that it doesn't get forgotten?
One thing that's big in CI and TPRS is having a word wall, which I'm not sure how well that would really accomplish them learning them on their own, but having the words that they've been learning all along available to them so that they understand that these words still exist. Just because we finished the story about the werewolf doesn't mean we can forget the word wolf. So that's one way.
Excuse me. Yes, I think that word walls are just cool when they're done well. I know I described the vocabulary reflection things. My students really get into making big, elaborate ones when we're like in a physical classroom, and they'll want to grab some construction paper and some markers and some crayons and stuff and make these big, colorful things, and then we would put them up around the classroom and or in the hall outside the class. And of course, that's like the best recruitment technique in the world for come take Latin, because you get to make cool things and they get put up, in the wall and then in the hall, and then we'll make other things and they get put up on the hall. In fact, at one school we had a very primitive form of self-assessment for how good the project was. Is it hall worthy or is it just wall worthy? Because a hall-worthy product was one that was going out in the hall and the whole school would see it, whereas a wall-worthy product was going to go up in the classroom and we'd see it and the other classes would see it, but our friends, or that person we were trying to get to date us, who we were trying to impress with our mad skills, would not see it if it was simply wall-worthy, unless they were also a Latin family member. So that it's funny because it just sort of developed because we had these two bulletin boards and a bunch of tack strips outside in the area, and theoretically they belonged to the whole foreign language department, but the French teacher didn't use them and the Spanish teacher wasn't right there, so it really worked out that they kind of became claimed by the Latin program, and so we put things, all kinds of stuff up there. And it did make them feel really good if they would say, well, yeah, I think this actually is a hall-worthy product. Or, then kids could perfectly say, I'm worried about the algebra test, and I'm worried about my chemistry honors project that's due next week, and I just really don't feel like making a hall-worthy product today. I don't have time. And that was perfectly fine.
So I'll make a plug here in terms of learning and retaining linguistic information, whether it's the grammar we're talking about or vocabulary or anything like that. The single best way I've found is to actually use the language. which I know is where some of us are and where some of us are heading. But it's very difficult to forget an accusative case or how it works if it's just a fundamental necessary component of your daily engagement in that class. It's very hard to forget a lot of vocabulary words if they're words you have to use every day simply to express what you're doing. Now, there are obviously vocab items that we run into that, even professors, you see it once, maybe every 5 years, it doesn't stick around that well. But the key stuff that we really need, those high-frequency words and structures, just using the language, they'll get there. I think the big challenge we have in teaching Latin as of the way it's been taught most recently for most people is that we don't use the language. So it's trying to hold on to a list of facts as opposed to just having it there as a tool for your everyday operation.
Yeah, I definitely found that seeing the same words over and over again in stories that that my students were translating, they could have the exact same expression 3 times in a story, in every single story, and they still would be looking it up every single time or asking me what it meant every single time. And I'm sitting there like, how many times do you have to hear that the boys are, kubitum ire to figure out to remember that means go to bed? And so hopefully using those things more orally and hourly in class will help out.
That's going to help. And the other thing I'd add with that, because you raised the question, is the number that most kids need to hear is actually an astoundingly high number. It's usually quoted as somewhere around 100, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, for most words, which when you're not using it, as I'm sure you know, if you read cubitum ire 3 times in that story, and then it sits a week and a half, and then you read it 3 more times, and then it sits a week and a half, even if it's in every story, that could be a school year before you've reached, your 100 times.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I don't know if any of you guys have done this, but I've thought about for vocabulary, having my students organize words that they know into semantic families. So, pull out the words that are related to personal violence and the words that are related to the household. And so have you guys done any kind of assessments along those lines?
Yes, it's particularly with kind of intermediate to advanced classes. Latin, I taught at a school where we were able to have a Latin 4 class that wasn't doing AP, and then they did AP as their fifth level. And one of the things that we frequently did in Latin 4 and did in AP as we had time, but particularly did in Latin 3 and 4, was that kind of organization of looking for words, organizing words that had to do with whatever. And sometimes I would pick the categories, and sometimes they would pick the categories. And and they would generate words that they did know, and then, by the time of Latin 3, they'd get interested in other words, and so then we would use either physical dictionaries, or we'd use Whitaker's Words and Glossa together, and I would, show them how to, okay, so, this thing, the English to Latin side says it means this, but let's see what it really means and how it's really used, and that was the thing that my kids tend to really enjoy. In fact, I'm glad that we're talking about that, because I'm reminded that that's the thing that I want to do early this year with the somewhat advanced group with the one district in New Jersey that we're continuing to work with remotely. Because they have a lot of vocabulary, but they're sort of, especially the Latin 3 kids, are just sort of at a point where they're kind of feeling overwhelmed by it. So those vocabulary family kind of activities are really, really helpful. And Ellie, it's true that it is common in modern languages, in modern language textbooks, and has been for a while, to have them like all introduced together. And I love the idea of dividing them into groups for each level, as well as Brenda is saying in the chat. One of the things that I found was really helpful was to go back, after we had done something like that, after the words had sort of been sitting there for for a few weeks or months, to go back and have kids make the categories and see what they'd really retained and what they hadn't. And so they would, there was an indicator so they'd make, a chart, and there's an indicator, they'd put a star by the word if they had remembered it without having to look it up, and then they'd just put the word there if they had looked it up and found it. And then they could say, okay, I really know these words. And then these are words that I think, oh yeah, we saw that one once, that was in that one story. But that was in that one story and that other story. But so that there's as much ownership of it by them as possible. I think one of the things that I've discovered in my journey over the past, goodness gracious, it's been a long time that I've been doing this. But one of the things that I learned really fairly early on was that the ownership of the task has got to be as close as possible to the learner. And so that, obviously I'm going to structure the task, but I should not be the one. I mean, with the beginner, yeah, I'm the one who's providing the words, but with the intermediate student, I ideally am not the one who's providing the words, because those are the words that, they should have some ownership of, and if they don't, then they can say, oh, that was an important word and I didn't remember it. I need to do some work with that word. If that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, it really does, Justin. I think we can even extend a lot of, if we're going to look at thematic or topical vocabulary, we can extend a lot of our work down to the early levels. Because if you look at the novice, mid, novice, high, and even to some extent novice, low qualifiers, they can use words. That's the goal, right? Have them give back single individual words and maybe short phrases, not so much sentence or paragraph formation. And you already hit on a great way to do that. You put a picture up of a scene and say, how many words can you describe in this scene? And that might be a good do now activity, even several weeks after a unit, to do sort of the review you're talking about. Say we just did the house, right? Wait 3 weeks, put up a picture of a house and say, give me everything in this photo. Just make a list. And there are all sorts of games that you can play to help reinforce it. I mean, charades is a good one. Pictionary is a good one. Taboo. You can play Taboo with Latin. There's a game that we play at the Conventiculum here in Lexington called Vas Vocabulorum. It's sort of like a charades type thing, except it iterates. So the first time, everyone writes down 3 words, puts them in a hat. I can explain the team structure elsewhere, but you pull a word. When all the words are done, they all go back in the pot, and you keep playing again, but the rule that time is you can only use 3 words to describe your clue, whatever it is. You can't say more than 3 words in Latin, and then the third time, just gestures. And the nice thing about that is even if there's a word that you're not super familiar with the first time, you do eventually find out what it is. You can look it up in a dictionary while you're playing, and then you hear it a couple more times in the game. It's not, oh, new word, and then just by the wayside. But I really like pictures as a great way to target a lot of that recall quick and easy in a context.
Whoops, sorry, I started talking, but I forgot that my microphone was off. I think that is so powerful, that any kind of a structure where you get to recycle the words, and you get to recycle them and recycle them the number of times that you need, that is so exciting. And it really, it makes so much difference. And also, the other thing that I keep thinking about is the way that we structure classes. I think we've all been probably guilty of structuring classes that seem like they're really exciting to us, but they're kind of boring to everybody else. So finding out what kids love, whether it's the kind of the TPRS couple of however many weeks or days or classes of circling with balls, or whether it's just doing a survey at the beginning and of the type that I've described a couple times, where I want to know, what are your favorite what's your favorite school subject and why do you love it? What's your least favorite and why do you hate it? That tells me a lot about the kinds of activities that will work for this particular group of kids. You know, if everybody's favorite subject was math, I'd be really surprised, but we'd do more analytic grammar. If everybody's least favorite subject is English, I know that extended reading activities are probably going to have to be structured in a different way because they hate those. And so, you know, and I've had both of those situations. One time it was the same class, and that was really out of my comfort zone because, I mean, I love grammar. I love, love, love grammar. I read the Grammatici Latini for fun. That's how much I like Latin grammar. But I don't necessarily expect my students, oh, sorry, as the cat went jumping across the screen. Hi, cornflower. But I don't necessarily expect everybody to share that love. And one time I had this class, and they were just really analytical kind of people, and they liked it. And I said, okay, let's see how much we can do. And eventually they said, Mr. Schwab, we love analytical grammar, but we don't love it as much as you do. I said, okay, all right, we found our limit now. That's all right. I think that was also the class where we read plenty. That was the class where they were in Latin 2 when I discovered that about them. And then when we were in Latin 4, we did a unit on animals, and we started out with Pliny the Elder on elephants. And the reason we did was because the one girl just absolutely loved elephants. She thought elephants were the coolest thing in the world. So we read, you know. So we read the thing, you know, where the elephants are worshiping the moon and, you know, doing all the stuff that they do and rescuing each other in the arena. And it was like, really? I can't believe you guys wanted to do this. And then they made me promise to use it with every other class that would ever be interested in it. So several times since then, I've had Latin 4 classes that we read Pliny the Elder on elephants, just because of that. So the power of student ownership and discovering what they love, I think, cannot be overstated. You know, whether it's something as strange as you know, my elephant loving class. Erica, the girl who suggested this, had an elephant pendant, and it was just a beautiful elephant pendant, and I complimented her on it. And she said, well, you know, I love them. They're my favorite animal. I said, well, I think they're cool too. She said, I mean, obviously there were elephants in the Roman world, but what did the Romans know about them other than, you know, the thing that she knew with the Alps and Hannibal and stuff? She said, you know, does anybody else talk about them? And I said, well, you know, certainly Pliny does, I think. So then I went and found the text, and it's just so interesting. And I said, okay, guys, you know, thanks to Erica, we're going to be working with this. And she was just so excited. It really changed things for her.
Well, it seems like with embedded readings, you could do that. You know, you could take, even at a lower level, these things that the students are interested in and find a relevant story and bring it down to their level while keeping it authentic to the ancient Roman world, but also authentic for them.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is the thing. That the power of the embedded reading is that you really can make pretty much any text accessible, and not necessarily, you know, 100% comprehensible, but accessible. And I think that one of the things that we forget, because we want it to be 100% comprehensible, and then we want to talk about, you know, all these philological things regarding it, but that with an intermediate level interpretive mode student, that what they're looking for are some amount of ideas and details. And can you get some amount of ideas and details out of this text with a scaffold of a couple levels of embedded reading up to it? Well, yeah, you can. And then you can maybe, you know, note some other things about it. But I think one of the things I notice, you know, on the one hand, is it's like we want our students to be at an advanced to superior level of proficiency from day one, and then so that's sort of one trend pulling us in one direction, and then in the other direction is that we want every word of every passage to be a word that the student knows well, which, if we really did that, is going to fossilize them at around a novice high level because they won't be able to deal with unfamiliar vocabulary. So walking the fine line between those, finding, oh gosh, what a shame, finding the via media, finding the aurea mediocritas is amazing that would be a thing for us as classicists, right? But it's really important. Oh, and I see Brenda's little one in the picture. So So are there other things that we should talk about regarding assessment, or is it a sign that maybe after a little bit over an hour and a half, our work is close to done and we should wrap things up? What do you guys think?
The only thought I would add before I think it's time to wrap it up is to follow up on what you just said, Justin, about the power of embedded text and embedded readings. But I also think one thing we do as Latin teachers very often is shortchange our students' ability to understand authentic texts from the beginning with the right sort of help. And I mean that in two ways. First, there's the modern language mantra, right? Edit the task, not the text. And so there are lots of exercises and things we can have them work with in authentic texts. And I think Reggie Foster's textbook that's forthcoming is going to be a real eye-opener into ways to do that, because I know that's his method. And also one that recently came out by Mary English has a lot of that in it too. But then I think as well, if we can provide the right glosses using synonyms they know, whether it's a grammatical synonym or a vocabulary synonym, we can give them more complex texts. And as long as we don't have that expectation that you worry about, that they understand everything 100%, all of the words, we can get them used to negotiating authentic Latin from real authors much sooner than we currently do. And that's all I'll say about that for now, but it's an interest of mine. If people want to talk about it offline or on Facebook or whatever, let me know. I'd be glad to chat.
And that is a thing, too, that we've talked about in some prior Hangouts, and I want to bring it back. And I am committed to the thought of developing those resources that we had talked about earlier this summer. I'll have more to say about that to everybody on Facebook and things going forward. Anybody else have any last-minute thoughts for the group before we break? If not, then I'll just say thank you so much to everyone for coming, and thank you to everybody who's watching and everybody who will be watching in the days to come. Gratis Maximus. And we'll see each other next week talking about something that will become clear in the next few days. And so right now I'm just going to say Valete omnes, valete amici, and we'll see each other soon.